At my grandson's welcome dinner, my daughter-in-law raised a toast. To the control freak who clings to every cent in this family. I took the microphone and revealed the truth about the inheritance. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. I spent 3 days preparing for this dinner. 3 days of cooking, cleaning, and trying to make everything perfect for my grandson's welcome celebration. At 61, becoming a grandmother was the brightest spot in my life since losing Richard 5 years ago. The dining room looked beautiful. Crystal glasses caught the light from the chandelier Richard and I had bought during our 30th anniversary trip to Venice. The good china, only used for special occasions, was arranged perfectly on the table. Fresh flowers from my garden filled the antique vase my mother had given me before she passed. Everything had to be perfect for baby James. When Daniel and Susan arrived, my heart swelled at the sight of my grandson bundled in a soft blue blanket. Susan barely acknowledged me as she handed James to Daniel and brushed past me into the house. Things had been tense between us for years, but I was determined not to let anything spoil this evening. "Mom, the house looks amazing," Daniel said, kissing my cheek. I could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the kind that comes from sleepless nights with a newborn, but there was happiness there too. "Nothing but the best for my grandson," I replied, reaching out to touch James's tiny hand. "May I hold him?" Susan appeared instantly at Daniel's side. "He just fell asleep in the car. Better not disturb him." Her tone was clipped, final. Daniel gave me an apologetic look. "Maybe after dinner, Mom." I nodded and led them into the dining room where my brother Thomas and his wife, my sister-in-law Barbara, and a few close family friends were already seated. Dinner began pleasantly enough. The conversation flowed, mostly centered around baby James and how the first 2 weeks of parenthood had been for Daniel and Susan. As dessert was served, Thomas raised his glass. "I'd like to propose a toast to the newest member of our family, to James and to Anne for this wonderful dinner." Everyone raised their glasses, but Susan's expression soured at the mention of my name. I could see her whispering something to Daniel, who frowned slightly. Thomas continued, "And to Daniel and Susan, may you be as blessed in parenthood as Anne and Richard were." "Here, here," Barbara chimed in. I thought the moment had passed, but then Susan stood up, glass in hand, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "I'd like to make a toast as well," she announced. The table fell silent. "To Anne, the matriarch who tries to control every aspect of this family's life and cling to every cent of the family money." The room froze. I felt the blood drain from my face as all eyes turned to me. Daniel looked horrified but said nothing, his silence cutting deeper than Susan's words. My hands trembled as I set down my fork. 5 years of keeping quiet, of watching Susan manipulate my son, of seeing her plant seeds of distrust between us. All of it crashed down on me at once. The inheritance that Richard had left specifically for Daniel's future and for any grandchildren we might have. The inheritance Susan had been trying to get her hands on since the day they married. I'd kept silent, to keep the peace. I'd watched Susan turn my son against me with whispers and lies. I'd endured her subtle cruelty at every family gathering. But not tonight. Not in my home, at the dinner I'd prepared to welcome my grandson. I stood up slowly, the room still silent, and reached for the microphone we'd set up for toasts. "Thank you for that." "Honest toast, Susan," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "Since we're being honest, I think it's time everyone knew the truth about the inheritance you've been so eager to get your hands on." Susan's smug expression faltered. "The inheritance that Richard left isn't just money to be spent however you wish. It was meant to secure Daniel's future and now James's education. Richard knew, somehow he knew, that it needed protection." Looked directly at Susan as I continued. "The trust can only be accessed under specific conditions. Conditions that ensure the money goes to its intended purpose, not designer purses or the luxury car you've been eyeing. Susan's face went pale. Daniel looked up at me, confusion clear in his eyes. "What are you talking about, Mom?" he asked. "The bank statements, Daniel. The credit card bills Susan's been hiding from you. The trust fund only releases money for specific purposes. Your father made sure of that. Susan's been trying to figure out how to bypass those conditions since your wedding day." Susan's glass slipped from her fingers, shattering on the hardwood floor. She swayed in her chair, looking like she might faint. The shocked expression on her face told me everything I needed to know. My quiet, reserved demeanor had led her to believe she could control me forever. She thought wrong. Daniel stared at his wife, then back at me, as the truth began to sink in. "Mom, is this true?" Before I could answer, Susan found her voice. "She's lying. She's manipulating you just like she always does." But her panicked expression betrayed her. The carefully constructed facade was crumbling, and everyone at the table could see it. The night was far from over, but for the first time in years, I felt the weight lifting from my shoulders. The truth was finally coming out. And no matter what happened next, I knew I had done what Richard would have wanted me to do: protect our son from the wolf in sheep's clothing sitting beside him. The silence that followed my revelation seemed to stretch for an eternity. Susan's face had gone from shock to fury in seconds. I could see her mind working, calculating her next move. "Anne, how dare you?" she finally sputtered, gripping the edge of the table. "Daniel, are you going to let your mother speak to me this way?" Daniel looked lost, his eyes darting between us. The guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. I hadn't wanted to do this in front of everyone, but Susan had forced my hand with her public toast. "Susan," I said quietly, "you've been lying. To my son for 3 years. Did you think I wouldn't find out?" Thomas cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should give the family some privacy," he suggested, standing up. The other guests quickly followed suit, murmuring awkward goodbyes. Once the door closed behind the last guest, Susan's carefully crafted demeanor shattered completely. "You miserable old witch," she hissed. "You've hated me from day one." "That's not true," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "I welcomed you with open arms. I only began to worry when I noticed the changes in Daniel after you married. Daniel had always been open with me, calling several times a week, stopping by for Sunday dinners. After Susan, those calls became less frequent. The Sunday visits stopped altogether. When I did see him, he seemed guarded, as if measuring his words. I remembered the first red flag clearly. It was 6 months after their wedding. Daniel came to fix a leaky faucet in my bathroom. His phone rang, and he stepped out to answer it. When he returned, he was different. Tense, hurried. "Mom, I've got to go," he had said, packing up his tools, without fixing the faucet. "Susan needs me at home. Is everything all right?" I'd asked. "Yeah, it's just—" He hesitated. "Susan says you've been calling her, questioning our spending. She's upset." I was stunned. "Daniel, I haven't called Susan at all." His face had clouded with confusion, then suspicion. "Mom, don't lie to me. She showed me the call log. That was the beginning. Small lies, crafted to drive a wedge between us." When Daniel mentioned plans to renovate their kitchen using some of his inheritance money, Susan accidentally let slip that I had called it wasteful. When Daniel wanted to visit me after Richard's death anniversary, Susan suddenly had a family emergency that required his attention. Each fabrication built upon the last, slowly transforming me from loving mother to controlling manipulator in Daniel's eyes. Now, sitting at my dining table with Susan's toast still ringing in the air, I finally understood the full extent of her deception. "Daniel," I said, turning to my son, "have you seen the credit card statements lately?" "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice strained. I reached into the drawer of the sideboard and pulled out a folder. These are copies of your financial statements for the past year. Susan's been opening credit cards in your name. Daniel's face paled as he took the folder. How did you get these? The fraud alert on your credit report. As your father's executor, I'm still connected to some of the accounts. When unusual activity was flagged, I was notified. Susan jumped to her feet. This is invasion of privacy. You had no right. I had every right as the trustee of Richard's estate, I replied. The trust is designed to protect Daniel and now James. Your spending sprees put that at risk. Daniel opened the folder, his hands trembling slightly. I watched as he flipped through statement after statement, his expression morphing from disbelief to anger. Susan, what is this? A $5,000 charge at Nordstrom? $3,000 at that boutique downtown? We agreed to save for the baby. Susan's face hardened. I needed those things, Daniel. Do you expect me to look like a pauper? And this account. I never opened this, Daniel continued, holding up a statement for a credit card I knew he'd never seen before. Your mother is trying to manipulate you, Susan insisted, her voice rising. She's always hated me. She thinks I'm not good enough for her precious son. I shook my head. This isn't about whether you're good enough, Susan. It's about the lies you've told and the damage you've done. Daniel looked up from the papers, his face ashen. There's over $30,000 in debt here that I knew nothing about. He turned to Susan. How could you do this? Susan's tactics shifted instantly. Her eyes welled with tears. Her voice softened. Danny, I was going to tell you. With the baby coming, I didn't want to stress you out. Your mother is making this seem worse than it is. I'd seen this performance before. The sudden vulnerability, the way she made herself the victim. I watched as uncertainty flickered across Daniel's face. He'd always been tender-hearted, just like his father. The debt isn't even the worst part, I said quietly. It's the lying, the manipulation, the way she's tried to turn you against me. That's ridiculous, Susan snapped, the vulnerable act dropping momentarily. Is it? I challenged. What about telling Daniel I called you, questioning your spending when I never did? What about the supposed emergency at your sister's house? The night Daniel was going to visit me after the anniversary of your father's death? Daniel's head snapped up. What? There was no emergency? Susan's face flushed. Anne is twisting things. No, Susan, no more lies, I interrupted firmly. Daniel deserves the truth. All of it. Baby James began to cry from his carrier, the tension in the room perhaps disturbing his sleep. Susan immediately moved to pick him up, but Daniel got there first. I watched as he cradled his son, looking down at the tiny face with a mixture of love and newfound fear. Mom, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. What else haven't you told me? The question hung in the air between us. There was so much more. The attempts to access the trust directly, the conversations I'd overheard between Susan and her friend about getting control of the old lady's money. But looking at my son holding his newborn child, I knew I needed to be careful. This wasn't just about exposing Susan anymore. It was about protecting what remained of my family. We have a lot to talk about, I said softly. But right now, I think you need time to process this. Daniel nodded, still gently rocking James. The truth was finally emerging from the shadows, but I knew this was just the beginning of what would likely be the most painful chapter of our family's story. The days following the dinner were eerily quiet. Daniel had left with Susan and baby James that night, his expression unreadable as they walked out the door. I'd spent 3 sleepless nights wondering if I'd made the right decision by exposing Susan so publicly. Had I driven my son even further? Away? The thought haunted me as I moved through my empty house, the remnants of the celebration dinner still lingering in corners I hadn't yet cleaned. On the 4th day, my doorbell rang. I opened it to find Daniel standing there alone, dark circles under his eyes, his shoulders slumped with exhaustion. "Can I come in?" he asked quietly. I stepped aside, my heart pounding. We sat in the living room, the space between us filled with unspoken words. Daniel looked around, taking in the familiar surroundings. The family photos on the mantel, the worn leather armchair Richard used to sit in while reading the evening paper. "I found more," he finally said, his voice hollow. "More credit cards, more debt. Almost $50,000 in total." He ran his hand through his hair, a gesture so like his father's that my throat tightened. "How did I not see it, Mom?" I reached across and took his hand. "Because she didn't want you to. Susan is skilled at deception. She said you're lying. That you've always been jealous of her and wanted to control me." Daniel's voice cracked slightly. "But then I found this in her desk drawer." He pulled out a folded document from his jacket pocket and handed it to me. As I unfolded it, I felt my blood turn cold. It was a real estate listing for our family home, my home, along with notes in Susan's handwriting about potential selling prices and calculations of how much money they could expect from the sale. "I don't understand," I whispered, though I did. "All too well. She was planning to convince me to ask you to sell the house. Said it was too big for just you, that the money would be better used for James's future." Daniel's voice grew harder. "But that's not even the worst part." He pulled out his phone and showed me a series of text messages between Susan and a real estate agent. The conversation detailed plans to list the lakeside property in Tahoe, the cabin Richard and I had bought 30 years ago, where we'd spent every summer with Daniel as he grew up. The property that was now part of the trust Richard had created. She can't sell that, I said firmly. "It's in the trust. She has no access to it." "She's been trying to find a way around that. These messages go back months, Mom. Before James was even born. She's been talking to lawyers, trying to find loopholes in the trust." I sat back, a wave of vindication washing over me. Richard had been right to set up the trust the way he did. He'd always been better at reading people than I was. "There's more," Daniel continued, his voice now barely audible. "I found a draft of a letter to a lawyer asking about having you declared incompetent to manage your own affairs. She was researching how to get power of attorney over you." The room seemed to spin around me. Susan hadn't just been trying to access the inheritance. She'd been plotting to take over everything, to push me aside completely and seize control of all that Richard and I had built over our 40 years together. "Daniel, don't apologize, Mom," he interrupted. "I'm the one who should be sorry. I believed her. Every time she said you were controlling or manipulative, I believed her. I let her come between us." I squeezed his hand. "You loved her. You trusted her. That's what you're supposed to do with the person you marry." I ignored the signs because I didn't want to see them. The way she'd change the subject whenever I talked about visiting you. The way she'd always have an emergency or a reason why we couldn't include you in our plans. His face crumpled with guilt. "I abandoned you after Dad died, when you needed me most. You're here now," I said softly. "That's what matters." Daniel looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and resolve. "What do I do now, Mom? There's James to think about. I can't just—" The sound of a car door slamming interrupted him. Through the window, I could see Susan marching up the walkway, her face tight with fury, baby James strapped to her chest. "She followed me," Daniel said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I told her I was going to the office to catch up on work." The doorbell rang aggressively, followed by pounding on the door. "Daniel, I know you're in there. Open this door right now." Daniel closed his eyes briefly, then stood. "I have to deal with this." I nodded, rising as well. Whatever happened next, I knew we would face it together. The conspiracy Susan had carefully constructed was crumbling around her, and judging by the rage in her voice as she continued to pound on my door, She knew it too. Daniel squared his shoulders and walked to the door. As he reached for the handle, he turned back to me. "I'm sorry, Mom, for everything, but I promise you, it ends today." The door swung open, and Susan burst in, her face contorted with anger. "What are you doing here? With her?" "Hello, Susan," I said calmly. "I think it's time we had an honest conversation." "Don't you?" She glared at me, then at Daniel, clutching baby James tighter to her chest like a shield. The confrontation I'd been avoiding for 3 years was finally here, and this time, I wouldn't back down. Not when everything, my son, my grandson, my home, and Richard's legacy, was at stake. Susan stood in my entryway, her face flushed with anger, baby James fussing against her chest. "So this is what it's come to?" She hissed at Daniel. "Sneaking. Around behind my back? Conspiring with your mother?" "Susan, please lower your voice. You're upsetting James," Daniel said quietly. "Don't tell me how to handle my son," she snapped, but adjusted her hold on the baby nonetheless. Her eyes darted between us, calculating. I could almost see her mind working, searching for a way to regain control of the situation. "We need to talk," Daniel continued, "about the credit cards, about the debt, about the plans to sell Mom's house." Susan's expression flickered momentarily before hardening again. "I don't know what she's been telling you, but—" "I found everything myself, Susan," Daniel interrupted. "The statements, the messages to the real estate agent, the letter to the lawyer about getting power of attorney over my mother." Susan's face paled slightly. "You went through my things? You invaded my privacy?" "Our privacy," he corrected. "Our finances. Our marriage. Our future." He gestured toward James. "His future." I remained silent, watching this exchange between my son and his wife. Despite everything, my heart ached for Daniel. For the pain of discovering the person you've built a life with isn't who you thought. They were. Susan's tactics shifted again, her eyes filling with tears. "You don't understand, Daniel. I was trying to secure our future, to make sure we had enough for James. Your mother has been holding on to that money like it's hers. It's not about the money." Daniel's voice rose, then he took a deep breath, continuing more calmly. "It was never about the money. It's about the lying, the manipulation." Susan turned to me, her expression venomous. "This is all your fault. You've always hated me. Always tried to turn Daniel against me." Before I could respond, the doorbell rang again. We all froze. "Are you expecting someone?" Daniel asked me. I shook my head and moved to open the door, grateful for the interruption. To my surprise, a woman who looked strikingly similar to Susan stood on my porch. The same golden blonde hair, the same delicate features, but with a kindness in her eyes that Susan's had always lacked. "Rebecca?" Susan's voice was sharp with disbelief. "Hello, Susan," the woman replied, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. She nodded to me. "You must be Anne. I'm Rebecca, Susan's sister." Susan's face contorted with fury. "What are you doing here?" Rebecca looked at her sister evenly. "I came because I couldn't let you do this to another family." The room went still. Daniel looked between the sisters, confusion clear on his face. "Another family?" Rebecca turned to him sympathetically. "This isn't the first time Susan has done something like this. It's why we haven't spoken in years." Susan let out a harsh laugh. "Don't listen to her. Rebecca has always been jealous of me." "Jealous?" Rebecca's voice was incredulous. "Of what? The way you manipulated Henry until his family disowned him? The way you drained his bank accounts and then left when there was nothing left to take?" Daniel's face paled. "Henry? Your ex-husband?" "The divorce was his fault," Susan said quickly. "He was abusive, controlling. He was none of those things," Rebecca interrupted firmly. He was a kind man whose only fault was loving my sister too much to see what she was doing until it was too late. I watched as Susan's carefully constructed facade began to crumble. Her eyes darted around the room like a cornered animal's. Chum. Told us she was never married before you, I said to Daniel. That Henry was just a boyfriend from college. Rebecca nodded. There's a lot she hasn't told you, I'm afraid. Susan clutched James tighter, making him whimper. You have no right to come here and spread lies about me. They're not lies, Susan, Rebecca replied calmly. She reached into her bag and pulled out a folder, handing it to Daniel. Everything is in here. The marriage certificate, the divorce papers, the restraining order Henry's family had to take out when she wouldn't stop harassing them for money. Daniel took the folder with trembling hands. How did you know to come here? Today? Rebecca glanced at me. I've been trying to track Susan down for years, to warn whoever she was with next. When I finally found her, I reached out to Anne through social media. I was going to meet with her tomorrow, but then she messaged me about what happened. At the dinner, I came as soon as I could. I remembered the message I'd sent late last night, after tossing and turning, wondering if I'd made the right choice by exposing Susan. Rebecca had responded immediately, suggesting we meet to talk. I'd never expected her to show up at my door. Susan's face had gone from angry to terrified. You're all trying to ruin my life, to take my son away from me. No one is trying to take James away, Susan, Daniel said gently. But we need to figure out where we go from here. There has to be accountability. Rebecca stepped forward, her expression softening as she looked at her sister. Susan, you need help, professional help. This pattern, it's destroying your life and hurting everyone around you. For a moment, I saw something genuine flicker across Susan's face. Fear, perhaps, or even remorse. But it was quickly replaced by the cold calculation I'd come to recognize. Fine, she said suddenly, her voice eerily calm. You want the truth? Yes, I married Henry for his money. Yes, I've been trying to get control of the inheritance. But can you blame me? Do you have any idea what it's like to grow up with nothing? To watch everyone around you have everything handed to them while you struggle for scraps? Daniel looked at her, bewildered. You told me your family was well off, that your father was a surgeon. She lied about that too, Rebecca said quietly. Our father was a janitor. Our mother worked 3 jobs to support us. We didn't have much, but we were taught to be honest, to work hard for what we wanted. She looked at her sister with a mixture of sadness and disappointment. Susan chose a different path. The room fell silent again, the weight of these revelations pressing down on all of us. Baby James began to cry in earnest now, perhaps sensing the tension around him. Daniel reached for his son. Let me take him for a bit. You're upset. To my surprise, Susan handed James over without protest, her shoulders sagging as if the fight had suddenly gone out of her. As Daniel gently rocked his son, speaking softly to soothe him, I found myself standing next to Rebecca, both of us watching Susan, who now sat on my sofa staring blankly ahead. Thank you for coming, I whispered to Rebecca. She gave me a sad smile. I should have found her sooner. Maybe I could have prevented all this. I shook my head. You're here now. That's what matters. As I looked at my son cradling his baby, at Susan sitting shell-shocked on my couch, and at this unexpected ally who had appeared just when we needed her most, I realized that whatever happened next, our family would never be the same again. But perhaps, just perhaps, it could be stronger, built on truth instead of lies, on transparency instead of manipulation. For the first time since that disastrous dinner, I felt a glimmer of hope. The living room felt too small for the 5 of us. Daniel cradling baby James, Susan hunched on the sofa, Rebecca standing near the window, and me, trying to keep my composure as years of built-up tension finally reached its breaking point. What happens now? Daniel asked, his voice steady. Despite the pain etched across his face, he looked down at James, who had finally settled into sleep, unaware of the family crisis swirling around him. Susan straightened, something hardening in her expression. Nothing happens. We go home, and we deal with this privately. She shot a venomous glance at Rebecca. Without interference from people who don't understand our marriage. I think we're beyond that, Susan, Daniel replied quietly. The lies, the debt, the plans to sell Mom's house. We can't just sweep this under the rug. What do you want me to say? Susan's voice rose slightly, then she caught herself glancing at the sleeping baby. That I made mistakes? Fine. I made mistakes. But everything I did was for us, for our future. Was Henry for your future too? Daniel asked, the question hanging heavy in the air between them. I watched my son carefully, recognizing the quiet strength that had always been there, inherited from his father. Richard would have handled this the same way, calm but unyielding. Susan's eyes flashed. Henry was different. I was young, desperate. You were 28, Rebecca interrupted. The same age you were when you met Daniel. Susan shot her. Sister? A look that could have frozen fire. Stay out of this, Rebecca. You've done enough damage. I think she's done us a favor, I said, finding my voice at last. We needed to know the truth, Susan. All of it. Susan turned to me, the mask of civility completely gone now. This is what you wanted all along, isn't it? To drive me away from Daniel? To keep your precious son all to yourself? No, I replied softly. I wanted Daniel to be happy. I wanted to be part of his life, to know my grandson. I would have accepted anyone who truly loved him. I do love him, Susan insisted, a note of desperation creeping into her voice. Daniel looked at her, his expression a mixture of sadness and resolution. Do you, Susan? Or do you love what I represent? The security, the inheritance, the lifestyle? Susan flinched as if she'd been struck. For a moment, I thought I saw genuine pain in her eyes, but it was quickly replaced by the calculation I'd come to recognize. You're not leaving me, she said, her voice low and dangerous. I won't let you take James from me. I don't want to take James from you, Daniel said. He needs his mother. But we need to figure out where we go from here. There has to be trust, Susan. And right now, I don't know if I can ever trust you. Again. Susan stood abruptly. I'm not discussing this anymore. Not here, not with them. She gestured toward Rebecca and me. We're going home. Now. Daniel didn't move. I think I'll stay here tonight, with James. Susan's face contorted with fury. You're not taking my son. Our son, Daniel corrected gently. And I think we both need some time to think. You're too upset right now. Because you've ambushed me, teamed up against me with your mother and my traitor of a sister. Rebecca stepped forward. Susan, please, you need help. This pattern, it's not healthy for you or for them. Susan whirled on her sister. Help? Like the help you suggested after Henry. The therapists who wanted to label me with personality disorders, who wanted to drug me into compliance. They wanted to help you understand why you do these things, Rebecca said, her voice gentle but firm. Why you manipulate people, why you lie, why you— Enough, Susan shouted, causing James to stir and whimper in Daniel's arms. She lowered her voice, visibly struggling for control. I'm not crazy. I don't need help. I need my husband to stand by me instead of betraying me at the first sign of trouble. Daniel rocked James gently, soothing him back to sleep. This isn't the first sign of trouble, Susan. It's the culmination of 3 years of lies. The room fell silent again. I watched as Susan's gaze moved from Daniel to the baby, her expression shifting through a range of emotions: anger, fear, calculation, and something that might have been genuine love. One night, she finally said, her voice tight. You can? Stay here one night. Then we talk. Just the two of us. Daniel nodded. That's fair. Susan turned to me, her eyes cold. This isn't over, Anne. Don't think for a second that you've won. This isn't about winning, Susan, I replied. It's about healing our family, she laughed. A brittle sound that held no humor. Family? You think we're still going to be a family after this? Before I could respond, she grabbed her purse and headed for the door. She paused with her hand on the knob, not looking back. I'll expect you home tomorrow, Daniel. Before noon. The door slammed behind her, the sound echoing through the quiet house. Daniel let out a long, shaky breath, looking down at James, who, miraculously, had slept through the final confrontation. Rebecca moved to sit beside me on the couch. I'm sorry, she said softly. I know this isn't how you imagined becoming a grandmother. I smiled sadly. Life rarely turns out the way we imagine, does it? Daniel joined us, carefully settling into the armchair across from us, still cradling James. What do I do now, Mom? He asked, his voice small, almost like the little boy who used to come to me with scraped knees and broken toys. How do I fix this? I reached across and squeezed his hand. Some things can't be fixed, sweetheart. Sometimes all we can do is move forward as best we can. Rebecca nodded in agreement. Susan needs professional help, Daniel. Real help. Whether your marriage can be saved depends on her willingness to get that help. Daniel looked down at his son, his expression a mixture of love and worry. And if she refuses, then you'll have to make some difficult decisions, I said gently. For James's sake as much as your own. The three of us sat in silence for a long moment, each lost in our own thoughts. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the living room. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own confrontations. But for now, in this moment of quiet after the storm, I felt a strange sense of peace. The truth was finally out. And whatever happened next, we would face it together. 6 months can change everything. As I sat in my garden, watching Daniel push baby James on the infant swing we'd installed last weekend, I marveled at how differently things had turned out, from what any of us had expected. That night after Susan stormed out of my house had been just the beginning. The next day, Daniel had indeed gone home before noon, as Susan demanded. But he hadn't gone alone. Rebecca and I had accompanied him, at his request. We'd stayed in the car while he went inside, James in his carrier. 20 minutes later, he'd emerged, white-faced and shaking. Susan had cleared out their joint bank account, what little was left after her spending sprees, and packed a bag. All she'd left was a note. You chose them over me. You'll regret this. The weeks that followed were brutal. Susan filed for full custody of James, claiming Daniel was unstable and influenced by his controlling mother. She hired an aggressive lawyer with money we later discovered she'd borrowed from a friend. She told vicious lies about Daniel to anyone who would listen, friends, coworkers, neighbors. But she'd underestimated how thoroughly her deceptions had been exposed. With Rebecca's testimony about Susan's pattern of behavior, the financial evidence of her hidden spending and debt, and the documentation of her plans to sell my property without authorization, Susan's case began to crumble. Her lawyer withdrew when evidence of her previous marriage and financial misconduct came to light, information she had deliberately withheld. Then came the turning point we hadn't expected. 3 months into the custody battle, Susan didn't show, up for a court hearing. Her phone was disconnected. Her apartment stood empty. She had simply vanished. 2 weeks later, Rebecca received a postcard from Phoenix. Starting over. Tell Daniel I'm sorry. Tell James I love him. No return address. No further contact. The custody case was settled by default. Daniel was granted full custody, with Susan's parental rights left intact but dormant. If she ever returned, she would have to petition the court for visitation. "Dad, look!" James squealed with delight as Daniel pushed him higher on the swing, his chubby legs kicking with excitement. At 10 months old, he was already saying a few words. "Dada" and "Nana," being his favorites. "I see you, buddy. You're flying," Daniel replied, his face breaking into the kind of genuine smile that had been rare in the years he was with Susan. My heart swelled watching them together. After Susan disappeared, Daniel and James had moved in with me, temporarily. But as weeks turned into months, we'd both realized there was no rush to change our arrangement. The house was big enough for all of us, and having James under my roof was the greatest joy of my life. "Mom, can you take over? I need to get those steaks marinating for tonight," Daniel called. I set aside my gardening shears and walked over to the swing set, reaching for the chains. "Come to Nana, sweetheart," I cooed to James, who giggled and reached for me with sticky hands. "Thanks, Mom," Daniel said, kissing my cheek. "Thomas and Barbara should be here around 6. And Rebecca?" "She's bringing dessert. Some fancy chocolate thing she found a recipe for." I nodded, smiling. Rebecca had become a fixture in our lives, a connection to Susan that somehow didn't hurt. She'd been as surprised as anyone by her sister's disappearance, but had also seemed relieved. "Susan runs when she can't control the situation," she'd explained. "She always has." As Daniel headed inside, I continued pushing James on the swing, savoring his little boy laughter. The past 6 months had been a journey none of us had expected, but healing had come in its own time, in its own way. Daniel had started therapy, working through the manipulation and emotional abuse he'd endured during his marriage. He'd reconnected with old friends Susan had driven away. He'd even begun dating again, cautiously, a kind-hearted kindergarten teacher he'd met at a single-parent support group. The sound of a car in the driveway pulled me from my thoughts. Rebecca was early, climbing out of her sedan with a bakery, box in hand, her blonde hair, now cut short, catching the afternoon sunlight. "Look who's here, James," I said, lifting him from the swing. "Auntie Becca." James squirmed with excitement, making grabbing motions toward Rebecca as she approached. "There's my favorite boy," Rebecca laughed, setting the dessert box on the patio table to take James from me. "Have you been good for your Nana and Daddy?" "He's always good," I replied with mock seriousness. "Aren't you, sweetheart?" Rebecca bounced, James on her hip, her expression softening as she looked around the garden. "It's beautiful here, Anne. Peaceful." I nodded, understanding what she meant. Our lives had found an unexpected rhythm, a new kind of family forged from the remnants of what Susan had tried to destroy. "Any word?" I asked quietly. It was our shorthand for asking if she'd heard from Susan. Rebecca shook her head. "Nothing since the postcard. I don't think we will. Not for a long time." I wasn't sure how to feel about that. Despite everything Susan had done, she was still James's mother, still Daniel's first love, still a woman who clearly needed help she wasn't willing to accept. "Do you think she'll ever come back?" I asked, a question I'd pondered often in the quiet hours of the night. Rebecca sighed, adjusting James on her hip. "I don't know. Susan has always been good at reinventing herself, at finding new people to, well, you know." I did know, and part of me hoped that wherever Susan was, she'd found the help she needed to break her destructive patterns. "Mom, Rebecca, lunch is ready," Daniel called from the patio door. As we made our way back to the house, James babbling happily in Rebecca's arms, I thought about Richard, about how much he would have loved being a grandfather, about how right he'd been to protect our family's legacy with the trust he'd created. "You okay, Anne?" Rebecca asked, noticing my momentary melancholy. "Just thinking about Richard," I replied. "He would have loved this. Family gatherings, Sunday lunches, watching James grow up." Rebecca smiled gently. He's still here, in a way. In Daniel, in James, in this beautiful home you created together. As we stepped onto the patio, Daniel was setting a pitcher of lemonade on the table, the garden umbrellas casting dappled shade across the setting. Thomas and Barbara would arrive later, bringing their warmth and support as they had throughout this difficult journey. Life had found its rhythm again, different but sweet in its own way. Later that evening, after our guests had gone and Daniel had put James to bed, I found myself alone in the garden once more. The stars were beginning to appear, pinpricks of light in the deepening blue. "We made it, Richard," I whispered to the quiet night. "Not the way we planned, but we made it." A gentle breeze stirred the wind chimes he had hung years ago, creating a soft, melodious sound that seemed to answer me. I smiled, feeling not sad but grateful. Grateful for the truth that had finally emerged. Grateful for the unexpected allies who had helped us through the darkest times. Grateful for the renewal our family had found, not despite the pain, but because of how we had faced it together. The future wasn't certain. It never is. Susan might return someday. James would grow up with questions about his mother. Daniel would continue his journey of healing. But whatever came next, I knew we would meet it with the strength and grace we had discovered in ourselves along this unexpected path. And in that knowledge, I found peace.